Hello. Today we're going to look at how to get free plants from cuttings. So, first of all, what is a cutting? Well, as the name suggests, it's a little bit of plant that we've cut to reproduce that plant. We're trying to make a copy of that plant, a clone if you want. So that's the idea. So let's do a demonstration to see how it all works. So here goes. I've got some of my old secateurs. Always a good idea to make sure they're sharp and well cleaned with a bit of alcohol or white vinegar or something like that before you start. We need to start by taking a bit of our plant. So behind me I have a buddleia which I want to propagate, so let's take a bit. Here I have a branch. I'm going to take it down here, right, like so. And this is what we call a semi-hardwood or hardwood cutting. Basically means that the branch that we're taking is woody feeling. It's not like a stem of a simple plant like a daffodil or a tulip. This is actually quite woody looking. And what we need to do normally is take a pencil thick stem, but here on the buddleia I haven't got much choice. It's actually a bit thinner than that. And what we need to do is cut it into lengths. Now I'm going to cut a length of about a foot. That's about 25 centimeters. In fact, I'll make it a little bit shorter than that. I think I'll cut it just here. Yeah. And so we have a little bit of stem that we can use. Now we need to remove the leaves because basically to have leaves a plant needs to have usually good roots to ensure that it can provide the nutrition and support for the leaves and so on. But here at the moment we don't have any roots. So there, we've taken it. Now on the stem there are things we call nodes. I think I'll show you a close-up of this. If you can see this in the here in the picture, there's these little bumps which are called nodes, and this is where basically leaves and so on grow from. But it's also where our new roots for our new plant are going to grow from too. You usually take a branch which hasn't had flowers or fruit on it, if you can, but again on my buddleia I think all the branches had flowers on them, so it just means they're slightly less likely to produce roots than the stems that haven't had flowers. But again, beggars can't be choosers. This is fine so far. Now here I have a pot with soil in it. Now the importance here is what we put in the pot needs to be very well draining. So you can put things like sand, garden soil, potting soil, or a mixture of those or something else, but the idea is it has to be very, very well draining. Its fertility is really not very important. All we need really is something to hold our cutting so that it can produce roots, and then we'll transplant it later on once it's thriving into the place that we want it to grow definitively. So what we do is we take our cutting. Now convention says often you cut just below a node here, and you cut a flat cut, and you cut just above a node here, an angled cut with the top of the cut being above the node. This is a convention, so if you have a lot of these on a workbench, for example, you know which end is the bottom end because it's the flat cut, and which is the top end. But again, that's just a convention, it's not massively important. Now what you can do also, which I'm not going to do, you can put the bottom end here, which is going to go into the pot, into some rooting hormone. Rooting hormone you can buy in your garden shop. You can also make it yourself using things such as willow bark. Again, look on the internet for how to do that. You can also use things like cinnamon, and people even put things like honey on here. Honey doesn't really help the rooting, but it is kind of antiseptic, and it stops your cutting being infected by certain bacteria or even funguses and molds. But I'm not going to do any of that. This is a buddleia. This should root fairly easily. So all I need to do basically is push it well into quite a tall pot. I've actually left a couple of little leaves there. You can leave a couple of little leaves if you want, or take them off completely. And that's it. I now need to water that very, very well and keep it damp and in a place out of full sun, so that it will start to develop the roots that we need before we can transplant it. This could take anything from a number of weeks to anything up to a year, depending on what it is that you are trying to copy. In this case, the buddleia. I think that will probably be ready to go certainly in spring, but other plants take a lot longer, and often if you have left leaves and things on them, they tend to die back, and often the cutting may look dead for quite a long time, but then suddenly spring back into life at the appropriate moment, which may be a year away. The other thing is there will be failures too. So normally you'd want to take, I don't know, I would normally take at least 10 cuttings and put them in here to ensure that at least one will be viable for planting when we need it. Normally there's a lot more than that, but it's always good to have too many rather than too few. One little additional note. Some people, when they make their cuttings, and I have one here, actually do something a little, well, not necessarily strange particularly, but something which they feel may well help the production of roots for this here cutting. And what they do is they take the end here, and we have, as before, cut below a node and cut above a node here. But what they do is they just scrape it like this, and they may well cut the node itself because they feel that that will root more easily than if left as was. But again, as I said, we're dealing with buddleia here, which will probably have not too many problems with producing roots. But again, an alternative for those who like to experiment. I've just given my cuttings a good watering, but I just want to show one more thing here while we're doing cuttings. Now we've looked at what I call semi-hardwood or hardwood cuttings, which is what we did with our buddleia here. But here I have a small cutting from a sage plant. And here I'm going to do a thing called a green, what I call a green cutting, or a non-hardwood cutting. So here we've got very much the leafy top end of the plant, and as you can see, lengthwise it's actually a lot smaller, so even the length of my hand, that's about 4 or 5 inches long. And what I'm doing is I'm just removing the leaves. As I said before, if you haven't got roots, your plant really can't support too many leaves, so I'm going to really cut it down to bare minimum here. So I'm just going to leave a couple of leaves at the apex of the plant. Now, what we're going to do is exactly the same again. Again, we've taken care of where our nodes are. And what we're going to do is put this into, again, a pot with a mix which is well draining. As I said, this has to be kept moist, as with the semi-hardwood cuttings, but it can't be soaking wet either, so that's why it's got to drain well. So you water it well, but ensure that the excess water drains away and it's not waterlogged. Now, because this little stem is rather fragile, unlike the stronger, as I said, semi-hardwood or hardwood cuttings, we need to use a dibber. Now you can use a piece of wood, a pencil, your finger or whatever. Well, I actually have a thing called a dibber here, which is just a way of making a hole. This allows this little cutting to go in without damaging the stem. It's just a way of being a little bit more gentle with your green cutting. Now, just a note on when we do this. You can do these cuttings pretty much any time of the year outside what I call extreme weather. So if it's freezing cold or boiling hot, that's not a good time to do it. Certain people do this at specific times in the year, particularly green cuttings very often in sort of springtime, and some of the woody cuttings quite often are done somewhere around the end of the summer. But really, any time when plants are growing is okay. Just remember that they won't appreciate extreme weather. So leaving them outdoors when it's sub-zero or when it's over 40 degrees in the sun is probably not a good idea. So, as I said, give them a good watering, and I'm going to put that somewhere where it's not going to be burnt to death or frozen to death either. So, one last little word. We've covered cuttings in general. There are a few others which are slightly more specialised, like succulents and cacti, where you can actually cut lumps of leaf, if you can call it that, fleshy leaves and so on, and reproduce that way too, which again is another form of cutting, which I haven't covered today. But that's it. The one thing to remember with cuttings is you need to persevere. You need to experiment. Certain things will certainly push out roots far more easily than others. You may have a much higher survival rate with certain plants than with others. But as I said, don't be discouraged. Just persevere, and you will be able to produce more plants for free.